A lot of people talk about how the third entry in a series is the one where everything starts to go to shit. Critics often complain about how too much is added to the point the product becomes overstuffed, otherwise known as the Spider-Man 3 syndrome. But I don't see that many people talking about the fourth entry, which can almost be seen as a hangover party. It's like they use up their ideas into third installments, but don't know where to go after that. This is why you saw Insomniac and Naughty Dog walk away from Crash and Spyro, respectively. It seemed like there was nothing left to do with them. And Wrath of Cortex more or less proves their point. It's interesting because it doesn't do enough to differentiate from the originals, while at the same time, it adds too much in a clunky and unpolished way. Admittedly, I tried covering this game a few years back, and let's just say that review falls apart by the seams. The jokes fell flat, and it was obvious I was trying to copy the style of the millions of other critics that reviewed it. But the worst thing I got wrong in that video essay was that I was too influenced by the online personalities to give this game a fair shot. So, having delved deeper into this game in what would be my third playthrough, Wrath of Cortex is not bad, at least for a game that was rushed out the door in 12 months. It has a solid premise for a Crash Bandicoot game, but you can tell how rushed this title was based on how rough a lot of the new features were. So much so that it brings down what otherwise could have been a good Crash game. So, with all that in mind, I decided to divide this Wrath of Cortex review into two questions. Does the Wrath of Cortex manage to emulate the Crash Bandicoot formula well? Furthermore, does it do anything to make the standard experience better? And how much do the new features take away or add to the basic core gameplay? To start with Wrath of Cortex's development cycle, it's interesting how this game gets criticized for being too similar to Warped when it was initially conceived to be a complete makeover of the Crash formula. After Naughty Dog abandoned Crash to work on Jak and Daxter, the Orange Bandicoot was left in the hands of Universal. The company's CEO, Mark Cerny, devised a new open-world Crash game known as Crash Bandicoot Worlds. The exact details are unclear to me, but from what it sounds like, the game was originally going to have Crash planet hop as he gathered keys to return corrupted worlds back to their normal state. Each of these planets would have been based upon a separate element, and they'd all be under the influence of the main antagonist, known as Elemental. Of course, none of this made it into the final game except for the Elemental concept, and even that aspect was handled differently. So, what happened? Well, it's very vague, but Universal and Konami made some form of an agreement, which caused Cerny to quit the team. After that, Universal forced the entire project to be redone into a normal Crash Bandicoot game in 12 months. Basically, it was a victim to the same exact issue that befell Enter the Dragonfly. But even though Wrath of Cortex ended up playing it safe, did it manage to at least maintain the quality of the PS1 formula? Well, for the most part it did, but it's still a rough version of its predecessors. The story is actually one of those areas where it does the same thing the originals did, just not as tight. So the game begins with Uka Uka lambasting Cortex and his cronies for not being able to dismantle Crash Bandicoot. When he tries to force them to come up with a good plan, Cortex struggles until Entropy and Engine both spill the beans about a super-secret weapon that Cortex has been laboring day and night. Of course, this turns out to be another Bandicoot. How original. Well, the only thing that it needs is a power source, in which Uka Uka points out the elemental masks provide that special energy. Later, Crash and the gang are resting up on the beach only to be interrupted by natural disasters. Aku Aku goes up to check what's going on. He learns that Uka Uka has freed the elementals. So, now, with Coco's warp room, Crash needs to go around the world to gather 25 crystals in order to lock up the elementals and stop Crunch for good. Overall, this is very standard stuff for a Crash Bandicoot game. The main issue here kind of stems from how it's all presented. While previously, Crash Bandicoot hadn't been known to be much of a story-based game, they at least showed us events that display how the villain's a threat. Crash 3 showed us the scene where Uka Uka is freed from his prison and Cortex cowering before him. In Wrath of Cortex, we don't see the elementals freed. We don't even get much of an explanation as to who the elementals are. You need to read the manual in order to figure that out. This is a contrast to Warped, where Aku Aku explains Uka Uka's identity. As brief as it was still something, and a lot of the scenes that feature the elementals don't have any substance. They insult you and leave. Their personalities blur together, and their names make you wonder what crack the writers were sniffing. I mean, Wawa? Lolo? Bionicle and Avatar had elemental-based characters, and they did their names better. Thankfully, Crunch was a more solid addition. Basically, he's a correction for the mistake Crash was to Cortex. As the deuteragonist, Crunch manages to have more character in his rebellious nature. After he loses the first couple of times to Crash, he tries to insist to Cortex that he could take Crash down on his own without the elemental masks. This really shows how he's different from the other minions. He's not a puppet like the rest of them. It also kind of could be seen as a subtle hint towards his own free will, foreshadowing Cortex's mind control over him, but they could have made this more explicit. So, all in all, Wrath of Cortex's story is a mixed bag. All the other original characters are their typical selves, being treated with respect. Aku Aku is a grandfatherly mask, watching over Crash and Coco. Coco is the genius little sister. Crash is the mute bandicoot with humorous mannerisms that give him the right amount of personality despite not being able to talk. Cortex and Uka Uka still have the master and slave dynamic. They're all treated with dignity with little alteration. It's the way the new features are handled that ultimately hold the narrative back. And trust me, this will be a common theme in this review. As a side note, despite his hulking form, Crunch never fights Crash physically. He keeps talking about how he's going to wrap his arms around his scrawny neck, but in all of the boss fights, he keeps using the elemental masks to shoot projectiles or roll over him. Even in the last fight, where he has the opportunity to fight in his own individual way, he spends so much time jumping across buttons to activate elemental-based attacks instead of doing a throwdown with the orange marsupial. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but if you're going to create a brute, might as well allow him to use some of that strength. Well, since we're on the topic of bosses, we might as well transition into how the game plays. Does the Wrath of Cortex's gameplay successfully emulate the Crash formula? For the most part, yes, but there are small issues that took away from the experience. It plays mostly identical to that of Crash 2 and 3. You go through a warp room, collecting crystals. If you break all the boxes or access a death route, then you're rewarded with a gem. Relics are rewarded through completing time trials. It doesn't really do much to innovate from the core Crash gameplay, but if there's one area where it surpasses its predecessors, it's the atmosphere of the level designs. A lot of the stages have more detail and life in them. In Crash and Burn, fireballs erupt from a volcano, falling from the sky as you progress through the bonus round. In Eskimo Roll, mammoth bones lay over the outskirts of the level, and the igloos hint at life once being present. My favorite level, Tsunami, takes place in a bustling city with people wandering about, carrying their cargo. What makes this even more dynamic is the fact that if you access the secret area for this level, you get to wander through the remains of the town desecrated by the tsunami. Most of the death routes took you to a completely different room, but Tsunami transported you to the same level in a different perspective. How cool is that? And of course, what Wrath of Cortex review would be complete without mentioning the music? All the solid atmosphere that encompasses the levels is expanded upon by this game's OST. Even though Fahrenheit Frenzy had Crash move slowly through the level on a jetpack, the upbeat music really raises the stakes of the stage. And then you have levels like Gold Rush, which makes use of triplets at varying tempos to convey the Wild West. But with all that being said, sometimes the music gives a different vibe to what is otherwise a level borrowed from the original trilogy. In Crash 3, the underwater levels felt more mysterious, which was reflected by a lot of the darker colors they used. On the contrary, Wrath of Cortex's seashell shenanigans was more colorful in style, and the music reflected this. Whereas Crash 3's swimming levels felt like he was exploring an uncharted domain, Wrath of Cortex's undersea levels felt like an expedition through the vast bounty of coral reef. If there was one major complaint that I had, it was that the music for the death routes don't change. Usually in previous installments, the death route music created a sense of urgency as you made your way through the multiple obstacles. Here, it just plays the normal music, so going through the death routes lacks that same intensity. It's a bit of a nitpick, but it does feel like there was something taken away here. However, there are more glaring issues plaguing the Wrath of Cortex that prevent it from being able to successfully emulate the classic Crash Bandicoot experience. First of all, they messed up the jumping. In a platformer, Crash's jump feels a lot slower, and it also takes some time for him to reach its fullest height. In the normal levels, it's not terribly noticeable, so maybe it's not a big issue, but in the bosses that require you to jump over their attacks, this problem made those battles frustrating. However, if there was an issue that was more prominent, the camera follows too closely to Crash when he's jumping. For some reason, every time you make a jump, the camera moves with Crash, making it hard to see the pit below you. This makes it incredibly difficult to judge the distance with your jumps, which made the platforming feel like a guessing game. While the rest of the controls work well, messing up on the jumping is unacceptable in a Crash game. You might say I'm judging this aspect because of how different it is compared to the originals, and to them I say that while it didn't ruin the game, the issue did create some controller tossing moments. Because of the slow jumping, Pyro was a frustrating boss. Because of the camera sticking too close to Crash, some of the death routes were harder since I couldn't judge the jumps. The other basic mechanics they really screwed up were the monkey bars and enemy AI. My god, Crash moves so sluggishly whenever he's on those monkey bars. Seriously, whenever I saw one of those segments pop up in the level, I groaned in disbelief, bracing myself for the pace-killing slog this was going to be. As for the lab assistants, they basically just stand there doing their repetitive animation without posing too much of a threat. They won't even change their line of fire if you switch positions. It prevents the enemies from feeling like actual roadblocks that you need to deal with, and more like lifeless animatronics going about their day-to-day 9 to 5. And the game seems to constantly use these lab assistants that throw beakers and fire lasers. They do add additional enemy types later on in the game, but the fact you kept seeing these guys in every level made their presence feel redundant. The last thing I'll mention is the presence of nitro crates. The death routes are filled with these to the point it's a bit overused, but sometimes this game has nitro crate-filled paths that lead to nowhere. In previous installments, a path of nitros was supposed to pique the player's curiosity so that they could discover a secret area. Crash 2 best demonstrates this with the level The Eel Deal, which was supposed to clue you in to discover the green jump path. In the Wrath of Cortex, the separate nitro paths don't lead you anywhere. Maybe you'd think that going through this extra nitro-filled railway and compactor reactor unlocked the jump path, but nope, gotta go get the yellow gem for that one. So, generally speaking, if we were to go back to the question of, does the Wrath of Cortex manage to recreate the Crash Bandicoot PS1 formula, I'd actually lean towards not quite. It comes close, but if Traveler's Tales had just smoothed out some of the rough areas of this game, then it would have been good. At least, I would have liked to think so if they didn't add so many of those additional vehicle sections. And yes, this is where we get to the second question of, do the additional features of Wrath of Cortex help or hurt it? I split the vehicles into two sections, the inoffensive ones that were forgettable at worst, and the ones that could go die on a hill. Let's start with the inoffensive ones. The minecart basically just has you speed up and slow down. I can't really say much about this one because it's over as soon as you start it. However, it's funny how the only other time you use it is in a race, and you can win by basically doing nothing. Well, maybe if I were to be completely honest, you have to nudge the left analog stick a little, but still, it's close to nothing. The next up on this list is the Atmosphere. This is probably the most amount of fun you'll ever have with the vehicle levels of Wrath of Cortex. The levels have a lot of twists and turns to make them feel fast-paced. However, at the same time, you do have to monitor your speed, because if you go too fast, you might unsuspectingly fall into a pit. So it's not too mind-numbing that you can literally do it in your sleep, while also not too slow to the point it's boring. If there was one complaint I had, it's that this is where the treatment of the Crash 3 villains really rears its ugly head. The intimidating forces have turned into hapless obstacles. Tiny does a half-assed job trying to block you from getting through, and Tropy just stands there and shoots tiny blasts Dingodile just sprays his flamethrower without much thought of where he's firing. And that's it for the passable to reasonably okay vehicles. It kind of goes to show how poorly implemented these were in the grand scheme of things. To kick off the list of shitty Wrath of Cortex vehicles, we have the biplane, which now comes in different variations. While its base form is identical to how it was in Warped, the other aircrafts fall flat. Take the Firefly, for instance. It takes too long to charge up your firepower, and it leaves you open to getting shot at. Again, the atmosphere of this level is very beautiful with the tropical islands surrounded by multiple gunships, but you can't enjoy the scenery because there are so many ships kamikazing into you. And yes, the enemy aircrafts love to just slam into your plane, draining your health. Thankfully, barrel rolling helps, but it again shows the poor programming of the AI. And then there's the submarine, which mostly suffers from poor level design. The underwater levels would have been astronomically better without these segments inserted midway. There are so many mines littered about, and because some of them are less visible, they're harder to dodge. Combine this with the sluggish movement, and the submarine becomes a chore to control. Other than that, firing torpedoes and dropping bombs feels fluid, although because some of the enemies pop out or blend in with the background, this did little to ameliorate the exhaustion these segments gave. Then there's the Jeep. Going down the main path of the Rhinoceros Chase and Jungle Rumble is fine, but it's the racing that's the problem, especially when you try to pursue the gem. Rigging all the boxes is a real pain in the ass because the Jeep tends to skid whenever you try to make a turn, which makes driving not the most fluid. It isn't rare to just drive right past a pair of boxes, and since there's no way to go backwards, you're just going to have to restart the entire race. So, the only solution to this issue is to carefully and slowly go through the track, trying to break as many crates as possible. And that's possibly the worst way to do the race. And still going along the theme of slowly progressing, we have the Jetpack. The controls are inverted, and you really have to get used to the face buttons in order to go up and down. It really takes some time getting used to, which is only accentuated by the multiple lasers and light beams hindering your progress. And I know that in Crash 2 there was also a jetpack, but at least in that one they managed to make the environment look interesting by having it take place in outer space. Here, he's just going through a lava cave. What adds insult to injury is that you can't go too high or too low, since the ceiling and floor is scorching hot, which makes it even more annoying to navigate with. Finally, we have the mech suit. While it runs a lot faster compared to the other vehicles, its weakness mainly consists of the fact that you have to stand still in order to use the fruit bazooka. A problem like this could have easily been mitigated if they'd given the mech a melee ability that would allow it to fight enemies close up, and honestly, it'd be nice if that claw in his left hand actually had a function. But sadly, this game forces you to stop in your tracks just to aim the bazooka. Another problem with the mech is that your jump has this extra animation preventing you from gaining momentum with the leap. Basically, they ruin an otherwise solid Crash Bandicoot experience. Now, some of you might be wondering why I don't criticize the different characters from Year of the Dragon while I do so with Wrath of Cortex's vehicle segments. It's because the Year of the Dragon characters were generally well executed. They controlled well despite being different from Spyro. They didn't have you trying to get used to a different control scheme like the jetpack, neither were there any chopping mechanics like with the mech. They just felt different to play, not necessarily bad. And speaking of which, you're now able to play as Coco on foot. And, well, she feels a lot worse than her brother. She suffers from the same floaty jump as Crash, but there's extra lag to her leap, which prevents her from being able to make it onto platforms smoothly. In terms of her moveset, her spin attack is fine for the most part, although it lasts for a shorter duration. But there's one move she does called the sweep kick. It's useless because you have to stand still while doing it, and it makes you wonder why Coco didn't get a regular slide ability like her brother. Another thing worth mentioning is that she does ride a scooter and snowboard. For the most part these are serviceable, but compared to the jet ski or Pura levels she did in Crash 3, it doesn't have the same spectacle. There's this feeling of speed when you're on a jet ski or Pura, and the scooter and snowboard were lacking in that. Although, I did like the little side task of having to go through all the gates to get a second gem into level Avalanche. Maybe having more tasks like these could have made these sections more interesting. And then there's the Sneaky Shoes power-up and the invisible crates, and these aren't worth talking about. Question: why is the super body slam in a death route? Why even have the Sneaky Shoes when they clearly inserted a super body slam? And considering you gain these power-ups by beating bosses, it's time to talk about them. Basically, all of them involve Crunch fighting with a different elemental powering him. There are quite a few people who complain about the fact we have to fight him 5 times, but I don't see the problem with this because you battle him in different forms, so each experience feels different. Although, these aren't particularly well-designed fights. Raku has you challenging Crunch in the Atmosphere. The problem is that the arena is sloped, so you're constantly fighting the physics. Combine that with Crunch charging at you at max speed, and you have a fight worthy of the top 5 worst boss battles in gaming. Changing the color of the rocks is an interesting mechanic, but it also makes this confrontation not feel like a fight since you're not directly engaging with the enemy. Then you have Drain Damage, which pits you against Wawa. Compared to the last one, he was actually quite easy. Still, he was a lame boss. All you do is hop across these platforms while either ducking or jumping over his lasers. Sometimes he'll cause the platform to sink, but none of these are really worth worrying about. Just hop and duck your way to him and spin him. Maybe the jumping issues make this somewhat harder than it actually is, but for the most part, it didn't really present much of a challenge. Although, I wouldn't say the boss fight was good. It was rather boring because of how basic the whole concept is. Come on, Crunch, you're a hulking body of water. Crush me! But if there was one boss I had trouble with, it was Pyro. Similar to Wawa, you're doing the same repetitive sequence. This time you're running away from him until you get the mech suit, in which you then pursue him while spraying him with water. This was a boss where the jumping problem was at its worst. Because the fireballs moved faster than Crash could leap, he'd just barely make it over the projectile. Often this led to quite a few deaths, and it got even worse when I got into the mech suit. Its stiff movement prevented me from dodging those mines. However, I later learned the mech could jump, so maybe that's more from my inadequacy. Lolo was basically just an engine boss fight except less intense. I have trouble coming up with things to say regarding this one. It was fine, serviceable, and it's just a standard Star Fox copycat. I beat him in one try, and it was underwhelming. But thankfully fighting Crunch does capture the intensity of a final boss. There are 4 buttons that Crunch presses in order to activate different elemental attacks, and they all involve different strategies to dodge them. At least that's what the devs were intending you to do. You can pretty much just cheese the entire fight by standing on the side since you can easily dodge his attacks that way. There's a special timing with shooting him with the bazooka, but then you have to spin Cortex right after doing so. And what does damaging Cortex have anything to do with hurting Crunch? Maybe it helps free Crunch from his mind control? Overall, it's a solid final boss to cap off the Wrath of Cortex. And with that, well, was it worth it? Is the Wrath of Cortex a shining gem in the rough? Well, no, not really. But I don't think it's as bad as I used to think. There's a good Crash Bandicoot game in there that gets bogged down by all the extra stuff it tries to add. It would have been better if they had gone with Cerny's vision, but for something that was rushed in 12 months, it still manages to hold itself together, if just barely. There's some improvement with the level environments, but those damned vehicle sections just ruin it. Combine that with some annoying elementals and jumping that's just off. Wrath of Cortex really is just a stale, okay imitation of Warped. To say it was the beginning of the end for Crash is an understatement. Now, there are some people in the fanbase that like to say this was the last good Crash game, since it emulated Naughty Dog's formula. I think it's a fair question to ask if it's better to play something safe like the Wrath of Cortex, or go in a different direction like the Titans and Mind Over Mutant duology. The more I think about this question, the more I feel there needs to be something in the middle. The franchise needs to be willing to try something new while still maintaining its own identity. As much as I love Crash of the Titans, I'll admit they kind of strayed too far from what makes Crash, Crash. In concept, the Wrath of Cortex tried to do new things while maintaining Crash's original gameplay, but they didn't execute it well. That's something I liked about Crash of the Titans. It was arguably well made. So, the idea that the Wrath of Cortex was going for was solid. Maybe given more time, it could have been polished. Hell, maybe Twinsanity brought that idea to its fullest potential. But I'm not re-reviewing that game anytime soon. That's enough of me doing repeats. Until next time, this is Dave Reviews. Over, out, and I'll see you all next time.